In an era where energy is the lifeblood of the economy, Venezuela is returning to the center of the geopolitical, not because of a revolution, but because the threat of invasion is gradually being openly discussed. After years of failed sanctions, Washington is once again looking at Caracas as a strategic target to reclaim. The reasons? Oil, power, and influence. But more deeply, it's the fear of losing control of the backyard, which the U.S. once considered its home turf throughout the 20s. In a discussion on Negocios TV, Spanish professor Joe Villarroya said something that startled many.
If the U.S. attacks Venezuela, they will create a new Vietnam. Is that a prophecy or a warning?
Perhaps both, because all current signs, from how the U.S. talks about democracy and freedom to their military buildup around the Caribbean, evoke familiar images from half a century ago in Southeast Asia. Professor Joe Villarroya is not a left-wing activist, but a scholar who has taught war history at Complutense University in Spain. He has written dozens of research papers on U.S. strategy in Asia and the Middle East. When he says Venezuela will become Vietnam, he's not saying it for attention, but because he sees the scenario repeating almost every detail from history. According to him, Venezuela today is the Latin American version of Vietnam in 1964, a poor, divided country, but with strong will and, more importantly, in Washington's crosshairs. The U.S. once thought Vietnam was just a small country that could be taught a lesson, but then they realized they couldn't defeat the people fighting for independence. With Venezuela, that mistake is repeating. Villarroya points out that every war the U.S. enters starts with words like protecting freedom, helping people escape dictatorship. But afterward, people always see American troops landing, missiles falling, and oil or gas as what's truly liberated. He mentions the U.S. fabricating the Gulf of Tonkin incident to justify attacking Vietnam. If Washington creates a new Caribbean Gulf incident to attack Caracas, history will repeat, only this time the loser will lose more than honor. They will lose the moral superpower status that America once prided in. Since the time of President Hugo Chavez, Venezuela has become a thorn in Washington's side. When he attempted to nationalize oil assets and push American corporations out of their it was a direct blow to the U.S. energy oligarchy. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, surpassing U.S. But unlike the Middle East, Caracas sides with Russia, China, and Iran. For the U.S., that's a strategic deviation right in its own neck. Since 2017, Washington has continuously imposed sanctions, frozen assets of the state-owned oil company PD, cut diplomatic ties, and openly supported the opposition. However, after 8 years, President Nicolas Maduro's regime remains standing. What angers U.S. policymakers is not just Maduro, but that American sanctions are no longer as effective as before. Russia provides oil refining technology, China buys crude oil, and Iran helps Venezuela restore its sanctioned refineries. The truth is, the U.S. doesn't just want to overthrow Maduro. They want to regain control of the regional order. First, to reaffirm superpower status after years of withdrawal in the Middle East. Second, to control energy supply amid global chaos. Third, to prevent Russia and China from expanding influence in the Western Do all these goals sound familiar? Yes, that's exactly a copy of the goals the U.S. set when intervening in Vietnam, to block Soviet and Chinese influence and maintain regional control. When the U.S. intervened in Vietnam, it had the domino theory in mind. If Vietnam fell to communism, all of Asia would follow. When they look at Venezuela, they have the Caribbean theory in mind. If Caracas stands firm, other Latin American countries like Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba,
and even Brazil will start thinking they can escape U.S. control.
Both theories stem from the fear of losing influence.
And that very fear caused Washington to act hastily.
Vietnam was once a chessboard for the U.S. to prove. Venezuela is now a chessboard to affirm that the U.S. still plays the role of global. But there is one thing that Professor Villarroya emphasized. When you want to teach others a lesson with bombs, you will relearn that lesson with blood. The U.S. lost in Vietnam not because of a lack of weapons, but because they failed to understand that human will is stronger than any. The Vietnamese fought for independence, while the Americans fought for honor, and honor cannot sustain an army alone. If war breaks out in Venezuela, history may repeat itself. Because Caracas today also has what Washington lacks, a righteous cause in the eyes of. It must also be mentioned that Venezuela and Vietnam have astonishing similarities. First is the deeply divided international context. In the 1960s, the world was divided into two poles, Soviet and today, the international order is once again fragmented among the U.S., Russia. When the U.S. dominates anywhere, rivals seek ways to intervene indirectly. Second is about terrain and people's war. Vietnam has mountains and rivers. Venezuela has the Amazon rainforest, the Andes Mountains, and poor residential areas ready to take up arms if a country is invaded. No matter how strong the Air Force is, it's difficult to control it. Next is the anti-imperialist ideal.
Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Patria o muerte.
Two different slogans that both express one thing: readiness to shed blood to protect. On the other hand, there is the covert support of opposing, like the Soviet Union once helped Vietnam with weapons and advice. Today, Russia and China are helping Venezuela with oil technology, anti-aircraft missiles, and covert. Finally, this is a propaganda war. In Vietnam, the US said they were protecting freedom from in Venezuela, they say they are protecting the people from a dictatorship. But the world is increasingly skeptical. The more they talk about freedom, the more people see the shadow of oil, precious metals, and economic hit. But does Venezuela have the conditions to become another Vietnam? This is a question that causes much debate. Venezuela does not have a long revolutionary tradition like Vietnam, and its internal society is deep. Millions have left their country. Inflation has exhausted people's lives. However, in such circumstances, patriotism is most likely to flip. If there is war, external intervention will make those who once opposed Maduro turn against the US. Villeroy analyzes that war could make Maduro stronger. Once people see their country attacked, they don't care who is right, but who is defending the territory. Like in 1965, when American bombs fell on North Vietnam, all political conflicts were set aside to fight the common enemy. If that repeats in Caracas, the US will not only confront the Venezuelan military, but also millions of people ready to turn every neighborhood into a trench. Throughout history, the US has always believed they could fight quickly and win quickly. In Iraq, they won in 3 weeks, then got bogged down for 10 years. In Afghanistan, they landed in 1 month, then withdrew after 20 years. If that scenario repeats in Venezuela, the consequences will be even worse.
No one can defeat a people fighting on their own land.
No one can win a war where every house, every neighborhood could become a miniature Dien Bien Phu. The US once thought Vietnam was a small battlefield that lost over 58,000 soldiers, hundreds of billions of dollars. If the US intervenes in Venezuela, they might win some initial battles and capture a few cities, but then they will discover what every empire has forgotten. Occupying territory is easy, but winning over. Professor Villeroy have bluntly stated, the US claims they fight for democracy, but democracy cannot. If the US truly attacks Venezuela, a chain reaction will spread across the region. Latin American countries from Mexico to Argentina will condemn it, as memories of Washington's interventions remain vivid. Panama 1989, Grenada 1983, Chile 1973. Europe, already divided over Ukraine, will become even more hesitant. Russia and China will certainly seize the opportunity to turn Venezuela into a Western Hemisphere Ukraine, a hotspot draining US resources. In other words, the US might win a battle but lose the long-term strategic. Half a century after withdrawing from Saigon, America still hasn't learned the old lesson. Military strength cannot replace the power of righteousness. Venezuela may not be Vietnam, but if the US attacks, they will turn it into a new Vietnam. Not because Caracas is strong, but because Washington always believes it is right. Professor Villeroy concluded the discussion with a thought-provoking statement. To become Vietnam requires leadership, popular support, and faith. But to create a new Vietnam only requires an empire unwilling to learn from history. Perhaps in this oil-centered power game, the US doesn't need another victory, but a new memory to escape the Vietnam obsession.
Like the journey? Subscribe and join the next expedition.